You probably think you know how death sentences work, right? Hanging, firing squads, maybe the guillotine if you're feeling a bit dramatic. But trust me, you haven't seen anything like this. Forget the usual methods, the one we're about to talk about is bizarre, and it's enough to make you squirm just thinking about it. This is the most absurd execution method in Chinese history, and it'll have you questioning humanity's imagination when it comes to torturing people. So, picture yourself in ancient China. You've just been sentenced to die, and the authorities aren't going for anything as simple as a quick beheading. Oh no, this is far more creative and disturbing. You're probably expecting a death by sword or maybe some executioner's axe. Nah, the emperor, in all his wisdom, decides that your death should be a public spectacle, a performance to teach others the consequences of crossing the imperial court. Welcome to the nightmare that was death by 1,000 cuts, or, more gruesomely, Ling Chi. Imagine the scene, you're tied to a post surrounded by the onlookers because, of course, this execution is meant to serve as a public lesson. The crowd is eagerly watching, waiting for the show to begin, and here you are, already shaking in your boots. The executioner steps up, armed with a blade, and starts slicing into your skin. And not just one cut, oh no. We're talking 100 cuts, maybe more. Your body becomes a canvas for someone's twisted art. Each cut isn't made in some swift, clean manner. No, the executioner takes his time, slicing off pieces of skin, carving lines into your flesh. The blade pierces your body over and over, and with each slice, you feel the pain intensify. This isn't a quick end. It's a long, drawn-out affair. Your body starts to bleed out, but the worst part? You're still conscious. You can still feel everything. The cuts come in waves, one after another, until your body is a shredded mess. Historians still argue whether this method of execution was purely for punishment or if it was meant to humiliate the victim. Some believe it was more about making an example of the person, showing just how much the emperor controlled life and death. Others argue it was a form of torture, where the condemned person had no choice but to endure the agony for as long as possible. The process was meant to break the victim, not just physically but mentally as well. You could scream, you could beg, but there was no escape. It was meant to make you face the inevitable death while being reduced to a mere spectacle for everyone to witness. Now, let's take a moment to think about how long something like this would last. This wasn't a quick execution. Instead, it was a process that could span hours. Imagine feeling each slice, each cut carving through your body, the blood dripping from your wounds. The crowd would murmur, some whispering, others gasping in disgust, but all watching in eerie silence. You could be there, bleeding, writhing in pain, and with each passing second, you'd wonder, when will it end? But it wouldn't. This wasn't about giving someone mercy. This was about prolonging death, ensuring the person felt every last moment. The clock would seem to stretch endlessly. You might think, surely, someone would die pretty quickly from this, right? Well, here's the shocking part. Some didn't. They didn't just drop dead from a single cut. The process was designed to break them slowly. The cuts would continue to come, but it took time for the body to give in finally. And in some twisted way, that was part of the punishment. Dragging out the inevitable for as long as possible. Your body wouldn't just give in all at once. It would fight, bleeding, convulsing, trying to hold on to life. But in the end, the process would leave you too weak, too drained to survive. At some point, the emperor would give the signal, and the executioner would end the suffering with one final, fatal blow. But that wasn't the goal. The goal was to make it clear that even death at the emperor's hand wasn't an easy way out. It was slow, it was painful, and it was a public spectacle. This wasn't a dignified death. This was a lesson, to the victim, to the onlookers, and to anyone who might dare cross the emperor in the future. Can you imagine what it would be like? Just for a second? You're tied up, trapped, and you feel every cut as it slices into you. There's no way to escape. No one can help you. The only thing you can do is endure. And in that moment, you realize, this is the price you pay for angering the emperor. There's no last-minute reprieve, no heroic rescue. It's just you, the executioner, and the slow, brutal march toward the end. And when you think it couldn't get any worse, guess what? The worst is still to come. This method wasn't even the most bizarre, the most horrific execution in the ancient Chinese arsenal. As horrifying as Ling Qi is, it was only one of many ways the emperor and his officials would punish those who crossed the line. You think you're safe from the madness of death by 1,000 cuts? Well, brace yourself, because things are about to get even weirder. Hang tight, and let's dive into the other bizarre punishments that came straight out of ancient China's twisted imagination. Alright, so you've survived, or at least endured, death by 1,000 cuts. You're probably thinking, nothing could be worse than that, right? Well, hold on to your seat, because we're diving into a world of poison, political intrigue, and eunuchs. Yes, eunuchs, those palace insiders whose creativity when it came to causing chaos should never be underestimated. Imagine yourself walking through the grand hallways of the emperor's palace, the scent of incense wafting through the air, and the murmurs of servants and advisors filling the space. It seems like any typical day, right? But in the shadows, in the back corridors, something much darker is unfolding. A plot, an assassination is brewing, and it's about to unfold in the most devious way possible. This story begins with one particularly ambitious eunuch named Zheng. His rise to power wasn't about strength or military victories. It was about something far more subtle: his ability to control those around him. Zheng's talent for manipulation had earned him a trusted spot at the emperor's side. But with trust came power, and power, as always, came with enemies. So, what does a cunning eunuch do when he wants to ensure he's the one in control? Well, he decides that poison is the way to go. But this isn't your average poison. No, Zheng's plan is a far more complex, far more dangerous scheme to control the emperor and eliminate his rivals. Poisoning in the Chinese court wasn't exactly uncommon. There were always whispers of slow deaths in the shadows. But Zheng took it to a new level. Instead of just slipping some poison into the emperor's wine, Zheng decided to be much more clever. He used multiple poisons in such a way that the emperor wouldn't show signs of poisoning right away. It would appear to be a slow, natural decline, something that everyone could dismiss as a mere illness. A few days go by, and the emperor seems weaker. His health deteriorates slowly. The court begins to murmur, but no one can pinpoint the cause. Historians still debate whether Zheng's plot was driven by personal ambition or aimed at consolidating power for his family. Still, one thing's for sure: poisoning was the tool of choice. But how could something so sneaky go unnoticed? Well, it wasn't about being obvious, it was about subtlety. The silent kill was the name of the game, and the court conspiracies were as deadly as any weapon. As the emperor's health began to worsen, it wasn't just his body that was slowly decaying. The court became a battleground, with every whisper in the hallway carrying a threat. Would Zheng's plot succeed? Or would the emperor uncover the conspiracy before it was too late? The palace was no longer a place of royal order. It had turned into a silent battlefield, and Zheng was ready to pull the strings. But just as the situation grew more desperate, a twist emerged. The emperor did discover the plot, but by the time he took action, it was too late. The damage had been done. The once mighty emperor was on his deathbed, and Zheng's role in the royal court became even more critical. Whether out of fear of retribution or a simple desire for power, Zheng seized control, and did so by poisoning his way to the top. You have to imagine what it must have felt like to be part of this. You wake up every morning not knowing whether the emperor has been poisoned again or whether you're the next target. It's a world of dangerous games where loyalty isn't guaranteed, and even the most minor betrayal can lead to a ruthless end. And the stakes? They couldn't be higher. What's even more fascinating and terrifying is the long-lasting influence of this method. Instead of making a grand statement like a public execution, poison in the royal court left a trail of mysterious deaths that nobody could directly trace back to the perpetrators. There were no blood-soaked execution grounds, no public spectacle. But the toll? It was just as deadly. This world of poisoning and political conspiracy was one that many never saw coming, even though they could sense something was wrong. The palace was full of whispers, and those whispers held a deadly power. The emperor's decline was not a sudden event. It was a slow unraveling, one cut at a time, just like the 1,000 cuts method, but far more insidious. Historians still debate the extent of Zheng's role in the entire political scheme and whether or not his actions set a precedent for the future use of poison in courtly politics. Was it simply a symptom of the cutthroat world of Imperial China? Or was it a deeper reflection of the morally ambiguous nature of those in power? Either way, it remains one of the darkest, most unsettling chapters in Chinese history, one that was filled with political intrigue, silent killers, and the ever-present fear of betrayal. Okay, you've just survived the horrifying world of eunuchs, poison, and silent conspiracies. Barely. But let's take a step back and revisit the original nightmare. Shall we? You think you're done with death by 1,000 cuts. The fact is, this method was merely the tip of the iceberg. There's a much darker and even more gruesome story buried beneath this famous form of execution. You see, the absolute horror came when this punishment wasn't just about one person being sliced up slowly. It was used for more than just punishment. You've probably heard of death by 1,000 cuts or Ling Chi. But what's the true story behind it? Historians still argue whether this was an effective method of execution or just an excuse to take a sadistic pleasure in prolonged torture. After all, we're talking about a public spectacle, one that could go on for hours. You've already imagined what it's like to be trapped in that situation, each cut slicing into your body. But let's go deeper. Why exactly did the emperors choose this form of execution? Was it to teach a lesson, or was it just because they could? Imagine that, for a moment, the power to end someone's life in such a drawn-out and gruesome way. You see, in ancient China, it wasn't always about the immediate death. Sometimes it was about making an example of the person in front of others, humiliating them. After all, the punishment needed to be as much about fear as it was about justice. Here's the thing. Some historians still argue that this wasn't a punishment at all. It wasn't even really about justice. It was about making the death feel like a punishment to the very core of the soul. It wasn't just a matter of the body being tortured. It was about stripping away the last shreds of dignity, making sure the condemned had nowhere to hide from their fate. It was like putting someone in a situation where there was no escape, no way to feel anything but the slow agony of each cut as it tore through their flesh. You can picture the fear and helplessness building with every single slice. But let's go a bit further. How long could a person really last under this kind of torture? Would they even survive the first few cuts? Or would the body just shut down from shock, blood loss, or pain? Well, it turns out that while most people died during the process, it wasn't always the case. Some victims actually lasted hours under the blade, their bodies battered, torn, and drained of blood. And that's where things get even darker. Think about the emperor's motivation behind dragging out the torture. In ancient China, emperors believed they were divinely appointed. They had to show their absolute dominance and power over life and death. To execute someone was not simply a matter of punishment. It was a public act of power, and nothing showed power more effectively than making someone endure their death in full view of the people. The cruelty of Ling Chi wasn't just the cuts themselves. It was the uncertainty of whether the victim would even survive. It was a prolonged torment, a mental and physical endurance that the condemned person had to face. Every moment they stayed alive was a test of their will to endure, and as the process went on, the more hopeless it would feel. The crowd, they would be watching, but the condemned person would be left with only themselves and their pain. There's something even more chilling about this. You see, Ling Chi wasn't reserved for any single class of person. Emperors used this method for criminals of all levels. From commoners to traitors to even royal family members. No one was safe from the torturous ordeal that could, quite literally, go on for hours. Some believe this was designed to show that no one, not even royalty, was above the law. But the true horror of Ling Chi might have been something more than a mere political statement. It might have been about power, fear, and the public showing of the consequences of challenging the emperor's absolute control. Could anything be more terrifying than knowing you might be the next one tied to that post, bleeding out under the emperor's watchful eye? Historians have long debated the exact role Ling Chi played in ancient Chinese society. Was it simply a form of punishment, or was it something far darker? A ritual designed to break the very spirit of the person condemned? It's impossible to know for sure, but what we can say is this: Ling Chi wasn't just an execution method. It was psychological warfare, meant to terrorize anyone who dared imagine themselves as the emperor's enemy. In the end, the 1,000 cuts might not even have been the worst part. The weight, the uncertainty, and the knowledge that death would come slowly, this was the proper punishment. It was like a countdown to a horrific fate. And when it finally arrived, it was far too late for the victim to change anything. There was no way out, no escape from the absolute certainty of their end. And now, with this gruesome act behind us, we move forward. But I'm sure you're already wondering, what other horrors were waiting for those who dared defy the emperor? If you think things couldn't get worse than Ling Qi, think again. The next chapter will leave your jaw on the floor. Now that you've survived the gut-wrenching spectacle of Ling Qi, you might think things can't possibly get any worse, right? Well, brace yourself because we're about to dive into one of the most disturbing and graphic execution methods in ancient China: disembowelment. This wasn't some Hollywood horror scene, folks. No, this was a genuine medieval punishment used by emperors to send a clear message to their enemies. But the worst part? Some people survived it. Yes, you heard that right, survival after such a brutal execution method. Please stick with me because this is one hell of a tale. Let's paint the picture. You've been convicted of treason, or perhaps you've angered the emperor. Whatever the crime, it no longer matters. You're being led to the execution ground. The air is thick with the stench of fear, sweat, and the unspoken tension of an impending execution. The crowd is gathered, eager to see another person's fate unfold. The executioners approach you with their tools, and you know exactly what's about to happen. The emperor, in his twisted form of justice, has ordered disembowelment, and it's not a quick process. The condemned person is strapped down, the executioner approaches, and the absolute horror begins. The first incision is made in the stomach, and the guts are slowly and painfully removed from the body. This wasn't just about ending someone's life quickly. No, this was about prolonging the torment. The emperor wanted the condemned person to feel every moment of their final seconds. It wasn't enough to just slit the throat or chop off the head. Disembowelment was an execution method that ensured the condemned would suffer for as long as possible. Imagine your intestines being pulled from your body, your organs exposed, while you're still alive, feeling the excruciating pain of each movement. It wasn't just about the physical agony, it was about humiliation. But here's the truly shocking part. Some victims survived. After the initial gutting, a few individuals, by some stroke of grim luck, lived long enough to be treated by a healer or found by someone capable of stopping the bleeding. But what kind of life do you think they led afterwards? You're looking at someone who's witnessed a horror beyond belief, and they're left with not only physical scars but psychological trauma too. Imagine having to go on with your life, knowing that you survived a death sentence that very few have. Historians still argue whether this gruesome punishment was used primarily to demonstrate the emperor's absolute power, or whether it was a cultural method meant to signify the victim's ultimate degradation. Some believe it was about breaking the individual's spirit, exposing their innermost being for all to see literally. Others argue it was just another form of public execution meant to send a clear message. If you defy the emperor, your death will not be swift. It will be slow, agonizing, and, above all, humiliating. Can you imagine? You're standing there, trying to hold on to some shred of dignity, but everything is slipping away as the physical and emotional pain consumes you. The crowds are watching. They are there to witness the final moments of your life, not for mercy, not for respect, but for the lesson that is being taught through your suffering. The emperor wants to prove that no one, no matter their status, is above the law. And it doesn't stop there. The horror of disembowelment didn't just end when the body was cut open. No, there's the psychological torture too, the knowledge that you would never be the same. Survivors of such executions often lived in agony, both mentally and physically. The very act of disembowelment left the body in a vulnerable, irreparable state. Even if you survived, your life was forever marked. The pain was one thing, but the shame, the public exposure, it was another level of torment. So why disembowelment? Why this gruesome, horrifying method of execution that left both physical and emotional scars? Control. The emperor wanted to control not just the lives of his subjects but also their dignity. The victim was exposed, vulnerable, and in a state of helplessness. But it wasn't just about making an example of someone. It was about breaking their spirit, ensuring that they would never rise again. But here's the kicker. Even after disembowelment, there were still worse fates to face. The emperor's tools of execution were varied, each more terrifying than the last, and each had its own brutal logic. Some might think it can't get worse than disembowelment, but in ancient China, the cruelty never really stopped at one level. It's a reminder of just how far the emperors would go to ensure their total dominance over their subjects. And now that you've witnessed one of the most gruesome acts of torture and execution in Chinese history, think about this. Could this have been a method of execution simply for political gain? Was it really about justice, or was it about power, raw, unchecked power? The answers are complicated, and they still haunt the shadows of history. But one thing is clear. Disembowelment stands as a symbol of how dark and twisted the imperial system could get. Alright, so you've made it through some of the most brutal methods of execution in ancient China. But hold on. Just when you think it can't possibly get any worse, it does. Picture this. A death sentence involving 1 million moths. Yes, you read that correctly. Moths. It's bizarre, grotesque, and downright disturbing. But this isn't some twisted fairy tale. It's part of real history, and trust me, it's one of the strangest forms of punishment you could ever imagine. Imagine yourself in the ancient Chinese Empire, a time when emperors ruled with iron fists, and death sentences were not just a matter of execution, they were public spectacles. Now, let's say you've crossed the wrong person, made the wrong move in the court, or offended the emperor in some irreparable way. The emperor, in all his unfathomable power, has decided your fate is to be sealed in a manner that defies all logic. You're dragged into a dark room, a chamber with no light except for the eerie flickering of candles, and you're locked in, alone. You can hear the faint fluttering of wings, but you can't see anything. At first, it sounds like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but then you hear it. A swarm, a sound growing louder and louder, 1 million tiny wings buzzing in unison. It's only when the lights flicker on that you realize what's happening. You're surrounded by moths, a massive swarm filling the air. This isn't a scene out of a horror movie. This is a real execution method that involved locking someone in a sealed room filled with thousands, sometimes millions, of moths. And here's the kicker. The moths weren't there to swarm around you. Oh no, they were used to eat you alive. At first, you might think that it couldn't possibly be worse than the suffocating stench of 1 million moths, the fluttering of their wings against your skin. But no, the worst part is that, slowly, they begin to feed on them. These tiny creatures would crawl over your body, gnawing at your skin, burrowing into your flesh. They weren't just flying around for effect. They were feasting on you, bit by bit. Historians still debate the exact how and why of this execution method, but one thing is clear. It was a sickeningly creative form of torture that served one terrifying purpose: to drag out death. The moths would attack the victim's flesh, and the longer they survived, the more gruesome their end would be. The whole process could take days, with the condemned person trapped in a room, unable to escape, as their body was eaten alive. Now, imagine the psychological horror of knowing that your death isn't just about pain. It's about exposure. You're completely helpless, stuck in a room with no way out, unable to defend yourself against the tiny creatures that are eating you alive. The slow decay of your body as the moths pick at your skin, feed on your flesh. This is the ultimate form of torture, a punishment far more about suffering than death itself. It's not just your body being consumed. It's your very dignity, your humanity, being stripped away as you become a victim to something so insignificant and small, something so incredibly powerless, yet deadly. What was the emperor's reasoning behind this? Power. It wasn't about making death quick or merciful. It was about showing that the emperor had the ultimate control over life, over death. No one was safe, not even from the most bizarre, terrifying execution methods. To be sentenced to die this way was to be humiliated, tortured, and broken in ways no one could imagine. As insane as it sounds, this method was employed by emperors who sought to convey a message to their people. No one defies the emperor without facing a fate worse than death. And what's more, the use of insects for punishment wasn't just about physical harm. It was about the psychological torture that came with it. The victim wasn't just afraid of death. They were fearful of what they were becoming food for the smallest creatures, unable to escape their fate. Now, let's take a moment to discuss why this method was so intimidating. Sure, the horror of being eaten alive is enough to make anyone's blood run cold, but consider the way it was done. The room was sealed, meaning you had no escape, no fresh air, no outside world. It was just you, the moths, and the inevitable outcome. The moths weren't there to kill you in a quick strike. They were there to make sure you suffered. The physical pain was bad enough, but the psychological terror that came with being trapped in that room, knowing you were slowly being consumed from the inside out, was what truly set this execution method apart. Historians, of course, still debate whether this was ever used on a large scale. Some believe it was a rare, extreme punishment reserved for the worst of the worst. Others say it was more of a legend or an exaggeration of the cruel methods used during ancient times. Whatever the truth, there's no denying that death by moth stands as one of the most bizarre and horrifying ideas ever imagined for capital punishment. But what does this tell us? That's when an emperor holds all the power. They'll stop at nothing to remind the people of just how little control they have over their own lives. After all, if they can devise something this bizarre, this horrifying, then no one is safe from the whim of the emperor. And you know what? Just when you thought this was the weirdest death sentence out there, you'd be wrong. There's more to come, and trust me, it just keeps getting stranger. Alright, now that you've made it through the bizarre, horrifying moth execution, let's take a moment to shift gears. Flowers. Sweet, delicate flowers, the very symbol of beauty, romance, and renewal, right? Well, imagine them being used for something much more sinister. What if those flowers, usually reserved for joyous celebrations or peaceful moments, were actually a key component in one of the most disturbing death sentences ever carried out? Let's set the scene. You've crossed the wrong person. You've insulted the emperor, or you're in the wrong place at the wrong time. Whatever the reason, you're now the target of one of the most bizarre forms of execution in Chinese history. The emperor, in all his power and twisted cruelty, has decided that your fate will be sealed not with the usual sword or poison, but with flowers. Wait, flowers? How could something so beautiful be involved in something so horrifying, right? Here's the catch. The emperor didn't use flowers for decoration. He used them for suffocation. Yes, you read that right. The condemned would be surrounded by flowers, not for a peaceful ending, but for an excruciatingly slow and torturous death. The flowers would be packed tightly, layer by layer, around the victim, creating a barrier that made it impossible to breathe. The suffocating scent of blossoms would fill the air, and with each passing moment, it would become more complex and more challenging to draw in a breath. However, what made this method especially cruel was its deliberate slowness. The flowers weren't there to kill you immediately. They were there to make sure you felt every bit of agony as you suffocated in a silent, choking haze. Imagine yourself in this situation. Surrounded by an overwhelming smell of flowers, you can't breathe. You can't scream, you can't cry out for help. With each second, the air grows thinner. The beauty of the flowers is in stark contrast to the terror you feel as your body begins to panic, gasping for air that isn't there. There's no sudden end, no quick release. It's a slow, relentless build-up of suffering, one that breaks your body and spirit at the same time. Why flowers, you might ask? What kind of twisted logic would lead to such a method of execution? Historians still argue whether the flowers were meant to symbolize the fragility of life, a sickening reminder that even the most beautiful things can cause death, or if it was simply another cruel display of the emperor's absolute power. There's something deeply unsettling about the fact that such a delicate symbol, something used to honor love and life, could be repurposed for something so barbaric. In fact, this method of execution was meant to humiliate the condemned. It wasn't just about death, it was about degradation. You weren't dying with dignity. You were suffocating beneath a mass of flowers, each layer a slow, deliberate step toward your end. The flowers, once symbols of life and beauty, have now become instruments of torture and death. It's a cruel irony that speaks to the emperor's desire to control not just the body, but the meaning of everything in the victim's life, even the things that should have represented peace. This execution method wasn't widespread, but it was part of the twisted collection of punishment tactics that emperors used to maintain their absolute dominance over their people. The message was clear. If you defied the emperor, you would face a death so strange, so horrifying, that it would haunt your name for generations. You wouldn't just be remembered for the crime you committed, you'd be remembered for the manner of your execution, for the sheer horror of the way your life was extinguished. Now, think about the legacy of such a method. Imagine hearing the story of someone who met their end by suffocating in a bed of flowers. It's not the kind of story that leaves you quickly. It lingers, festers, and plants a seed of fear in the minds of anyone who dares question the emperor's rule. The terror isn't just in the method, it's in the lesson. The emperor's justice was unpredictable, and it would not be very sympathetic in its pursuit of power. But hold on, you might think you've heard the worst of it now, right? Well, we're just getting started. This is just one example of the madness that permeated the Chinese imperial system. And as strange as this execution method was, there are even weirder, even more disturbing tales to tell. Alright, you've survived all sorts of unimaginable horrors, from the suffocating flowers to the silent killers of the court. But now, let's move to something that might actually make you feel a little bit sorry for the victim, because this one is tragicomic, and it's all about a guy who literally died from his own mistake. So, picture yourself back in ancient China. Nothing quite as brutal as the earlier executions, but still a perilous time to live. Now, imagine a man, let's call him Liang. A noble, well-connected man, someone who felt confident in his place in the emperor's court. Liang, like many others in such a high-stakes environment, believed he could play the game. He thought he could manipulate things in his favor, bending situations to suit his needs. Unfortunately, this cocky attitude would soon be the death of him. The story goes like this. Liang held a significant position in the imperial court, and with that power came considerable responsibility. But instead of making decisions carefully, he let his ego get the best of him. Liang wasn't satisfied with just being well off. He wanted more. He wanted power, he wanted glory, and he wanted to make sure everyone knew just how important he was. But there was one small problem. He overplayed his hand. In a fit of arrogance, Liang tried to undermine a political rival. He thought he could outwit them by making a big move. Maybe by telling the emperor some juicy rumors, or by making some deal behind the scenes. He thought his influence and charm would get him out of any trouble. But here's the thing about ancient Chinese politics. It was ruthless. And in this case, Liang's betrayal didn't just fall flat. It backfired most horrifically. The emperor, not known for his mercy, quickly caught wind of Liang's scheming. Now, remember, in ancient China, when you made a mistake this big, there were consequences, and they weren't the kind of consequences you could apologize for. The emperor had Liang dragged before him in front of the entire court, ready to make an example of his foolishness. But here's where it gets interesting. The emperor didn't immediately order Liang's death. No, the emperor made him wait. For days, Liang was left in suspense, not knowing whether he'd be executed, exiled, or just disgraced. The uncertainty was enough to drive anyone mad. He paced in his cell, his thoughts swirling, his plans falling apart, and all the while, he couldn't help but think about the error he made. The mistake that had led him here. It wasn't just the emperor he had betrayed, but his own arrogance. He tried to be clever, tried to outsmart the very system he thought he understood. But now it was clear. The system had outsmarted him. So what happened next? Here's the kicker. When the time came for the emperor to make his decision, Liang, in a desperate move, tried to plead his case. He begged. He cried. He tried to show just how valuable he was to the emperor's reign. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The emperor, with a cold smile, ordered his immediate execution. Not because he was a traitor, but because he had failed to read the game correctly. The real death sentence came not from the emperor's sword but from Liang's own ego. He had been so confident in his manipulation, so sure of his own cleverness, that he failed to see the trap he was walking into. In trying to outmaneuver everyone, he had trapped himself. The ultimate irony? Liang didn't die from the execution. It was his own mistake that killed him. It was his overconfidence, his inability to understand the danger he was in, and his sheer hubris that made him blind to the reality of the court's ruthless nature. He literally self-sabotaged. If only he had stayed humble, kept his plans to himself, or thought through his actions, he might have lived to see another day. However, his ambition ultimately became his downfall. Imagine how humiliating that must have been. Not just to be executed, but to know that it wasn't the emperor who killed you, it was your own stupidity. You could almost picture the scene. Liang standing there, realizing too late that his fate was sealed, not by a sword, but by his own blunder. This tragicomic tale serves as a cautionary lesson. The court of ancient China was not just a place of politics. It was a place of fatal consequences for those who couldn't navigate its dangers. You couldn't afford to be cocky because, as Liang learned the hard way, a single mistake could end your life. And what makes it even worse, Liang's death wasn't just a punishment. It was the result of his own misjudgment, a direct consequence of his overreaching ambition. In the end, Liang was just another person who thought he could beat the system only to fall victim to it. And though we can almost laugh at how foolish he was, it's a reminder that in the court of power, arrogance and miscalculation can be the deadliest weapons of all. Alright, you've survived all sorts of unimaginable horrors, from the suffocating flowers to the silent killers of the court. But now, let's move to something that might actually make you feel a little bit sorry for the victim, because this is tragicomic, and it's all about a guy who literally died from his own mistake. So, picture yourself back in ancient China. Nothing quite as brutal as the earlier executions, but still a perilous time to live. Now, imagine a man, let's call him Liang, a noble, well-connected man, someone who felt confident in his place in the emperor's court. Liang, like many others in such a high-stakes environment, believed he could play the game. He thought he could manipulate things in his favor, bending situations to suit his needs. Unfortunately, this cocky attitude would soon be the death of him. The story goes like this. Liang held a significant position in the imperial court, and with that power came considerable responsibility. But instead of making decisions carefully, he let his ego get the best of him. Liang wasn't satisfied with just being well off. He wanted more. He wanted power, he wanted glory, and he wanted to make sure everyone knew just how important he was. But there was one small problem. He overplayed his hand. In a fit of arrogance, Liang tried to undermine a political rival. He thought he could outwit them by making a big move. Maybe by telling the emperor some juicy rumors, or by making some deal behind the scenes. He thought his influence and charm would get him out of any trouble. But here's the thing about ancient Chinese politics. It was ruthless. And in this case, Liang's betrayal didn't just fall flat. It backfired most horrifically. The emperor, not known for his mercy, quickly caught wind of Liang's scheming. Now, remember, in ancient China, when you made a mistake this big, there were consequences, and they weren't the kind of consequences you could apologize for. The emperor had Liang dragged before him in front of the entire court, ready to make an example of his foolishness. But here's where it gets interesting. The emperor didn't immediately order Liang's death. No, the emperor made him wait. For days, Liang was left in suspense, not knowing whether he'd be executed, exiled, or just disgraced. The uncertainty was enough to drive anyone mad. He paced in his cell, his thoughts swirling, his plans falling apart, and all the while, he couldn't help but think about the error he made. The mistake that had led him here. It wasn't just the emperor he had betrayed, but his own arrogance. He tried to be clever, tried to outsmart the very system he thought he understood. But now it was clear. The system had outsmarted him. So what happened next? Here's the kicker. When the time came for the emperor to make his decision, Liang, in a desperate move, tried to plead his case. He begged. He cried. He tried to show just how valuable he was to the emperor's reign. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The emperor, with a cold smile, ordered his immediate execution. Not because he was a traitor, but because he had failed to read the game correctly. The real death sentence came not from the emperor's sword but from Liang's own ego. He had been so confident in his manipulation, so sure of his own cleverness, that he failed to see the trap he was walking into. In trying to outmaneuver everyone, he had trapped himself. The ultimate irony? Liang didn't die from the execution. It was his own mistake that killed him. It was his overconfidence, his inability to understand the danger he was in, and his sheer hubris that made him blind to the reality of the court's ruthless nature. He literally self-sabotaged. If only he had stayed humble, kept his plans to himself, or thought through his actions, he might have lived to see another day. However, his ambition ultimately became his downfall. Imagine how humiliating that must have been. Not just to be executed, but to know that it wasn't the emperor who killed you, it was your own stupidity. You could almost picture the scene. Liang standing there, realizing too late that his fate was sealed, not by a sword, but by his own blunder. This tragicomic tale serves as a cautionary lesson. The court of ancient China was not just a place of politics. It was a place of fatal consequences for those who couldn't navigate its dangers. You couldn't afford to be cocky because, as Liang learned the hard way, a single mistake could end your life. And what makes it even worse, Liang's death wasn't just a punishment. It was the result of his own misjudgment, a direct consequence of his overreaching ambition. In the end, Liang was just another person who thought he could beat the system only to fall victim to it. And though we can almost laugh at how foolish he was, it's a reminder that in the court of power, arrogance and miscalculation can be the deadliest weapons of all. We've seen death by 1,000 cuts, the silent killers lurking in the shadows, and the tragedy of a man undone by his own arrogance. But here's a concept that might sound a little more honorable at first: dying by the emperor's will. You might think, that sounds like a noble way to go, right? A kind of martyrdom. Well, think again. This isn't the glory-filled death that the word honor might suggest. In fact, it's far more twisted than that. Imagine you're a high-ranking official, a military general, or even a member of the imperial family. You've served the emperor loyally, perhaps even for years. You've been trusted, and your work has earned you the emperor's favor. But then suddenly something changes. You've fallen out of favor, or perhaps you've been set up by a rival. You don't know it yet, but your death has already been decided. The emperor has ordered it. Now, the idea of being executed by the emperor's command might sound like an honorable way to die. Maybe it's seen as a final act of loyalty. After all, in the court of ancient China, dying by royal decree could be perceived as a privilege. You might even think, at least it's an official death. It's not just some random execution. But that's where the lie begins. Here's the truth. Being executed by the emperor's will wasn't some noble end. It was, in fact, a public display of the emperor's absolute control over life and death. The emperor didn't want to kill you simply. He tried to make an example of you. You weren't just a victim of a power struggle. You were the scapegoat, a symbol of whatever the emperor needed to prove. Picture the scene. You've been summoned by the emperor. You're told that your death is by royal decree, and though you might expect an immediate, swift execution, the reality is much darker. The emperor's will include something like a public trial, but not one where you can mount a defense. No, it's a show trial, designed to make you look guilty before you even open your mouth. In some cases, the emperor might even offer you the choice of committing suicide as a way to preserve your honor. However, if you choose to resist, the execution will be specific and public, ensuring that everyone sees the consequences of defying the emperor's absolute power. You're not just dying because of your crimes. You're dying to make a statement. The emperor needs to remind everyone that his word is law, that no one, not even the most trusted official, can escape his wrath once it's been decided. But here's the real kicker. The idea of honor? It's just a lie the emperor tells you to make death feel less like an execution and more like an acceptance of fate. There's no glory in dying by the emperor's will. It's not a martyr's death. It's a political statement intended to strike fear into anyone who might consider challenging the emperor's authority. You weren't chosen for your honor, you were chosen to die to prove a point. And it gets worse. The method of execution wasn't always a clean, quick one. The emperor often preferred public executions for a reason. These weren't just about the person dying. They were about the spectacle. Crowds gathered to watch, and it wasn't just the condemned who suffered. The public had to endure the slow, drawn-out death, too, as a lesson on what happens when you cross the emperor. Imagine being a high-ranking official or military leader. You were once the emperor's trusted ally, someone who had the emperor's ear and enjoyed the power that came with it. But now, you're standing in front of the crowds, your fate sealed, knowing that your death will serve only to demonstrate the emperor's dominance over you, over everyone. There is no escape, no second chance. Now, imagine the worst possible end. Being executed in front of your peers, with all your power stripped away, your reputation shattered, and your final moments being dragged out for everyone to see. The emperor gets to decide not just your life, but how you will be remembered. Not for your achievements, but for your failure to keep the emperor's favor. It's a public spectacle, a reminder to everyone watching that no one, no matter how powerful, is untouchable. It's a grim truth about the nature of absolute power. It's unpredictable, and it will break you down in ways you never saw coming. But here's the paradox. As terrible as it sounds, others actually chose to die this way. Some high-ranking officials, knowing the emperor's wrath was inevitable, opted for the honorable route of suicide. It was seen as a way to maintain some semblance of control over the situation, a final act of self-determination before they were dragged into the emperor's hands. Was this honor really a better choice than facing execution? Historians still debate whether dying by the emperor's will was a mark of disgrace or a final act of loyalty. Either way, one thing is sure. It wasn't a death anyone would choose unless forced to. And just when you think it couldn't get any more bizarre, wait until you hear about the following method of execution. It involves fire, and I promise you, it's just as twisted as it sounds. If you thought Ling Chi or the suffocating flowers were the darkest methods of execution, get ready for something that'll make those methods look almost tame. We're talking about trial by fire, and no, this isn't some metaphor. This is literal fire. Imagine yourself as someone accused of a serious crime, something that has caught the emperor's eye, and you've been sentenced to death. You've survived poison, suffocating flowers, and the brutality of Ling Chi. But nothing could prepare you for the absolute terror that awaits when the emperor decides your fate will be decided by fire. You're led to the execution site, and as you step out, you see it. A massive pit of fire, flames licking the air, rising higher and higher, as if the earth itself is about to swallow you whole. The heat is intense, almost unbearable. The crowd, gathered to witness the spectacle, murmurs, watching with morbid curiosity. The fire is not just meant to kill you, it's meant to destroy you body and soul. Here's how it worked. The condemned person would be placed in front of a great fire pit or even forced to walk into the flames themselves. Some accounts say the executioner would tie the victim to a post, and fire would be set all around them. Others say they would be forced to walk barefoot across hot coals. A slow, excruciating process where the condemned's flesh would burn with each step. Either way, the intensity of the fire was meant to ensure that the person wouldn't just die, they would suffer until the very end. Can you even imagine what that would feel like? The blistering heat of the fire burning your skin, the smell of flesh sizzling, your mind racing, knowing that escape is impossible, that this is how you will die. The agony would be intense. The flames would eat at you, scorch your skin, and slowly consume you, until you either collapsed from the pain or died in the fire itself. But here's the kicker. The trial by fire wasn't just a regular execution. It was a show trial meant to serve as a warning to everyone who watched. The emperor wasn't just killing someone for punishment. He was making sure the crowd saw the absolute power he held over life and death. He wanted them to feel the heat, to feel the terror of knowing that their fate could be sealed just as easily if they stepped out of line. It was a public execution that burned a lesson into the minds of anyone who dared to witness it. And the terror didn't stop with the fire itself. If you were lucky enough to survive the flames, you weren't just released. You were left with scars that would haunt you for the rest of your life. Imagine walking away from the fire, only to realize that your skin is forever marked, your body a charred reminder of the emperor's absolute control. Some survivors of trial by fire never truly survived the psychological impact. It wasn't just about losing your life. It was about losing your humanity, being reduced to nothing but a lesson for others to learn from. Historians argue whether trial by fire was used regularly or just as a rare spectacle. Either way, the intent behind it is undeniable. terror. The emperor used fire not just as a means of execution, but as a tool of psychological warfare. If you've ever wondered how a ruler could keep his subjects in check without bloodshed, this was the answer: fear. This is where the absolute power of the emperor became a terrifying reality. Trial by fire wasn't just about execution. It was about breaking the spirit of anyone who dared question the emperor's rule. No one who witnessed it would forget the sight of a person burning to death, their skin curling and blistering under the intense heat. It wasn't just a method of execution. It was an image, an idea that would stick with people for generations. But as horrifying as trial by fire was, it wasn't the only execution method designed to create such fear. In fact, it was only one of many ways the emperor could show his power. And when you think the fire has burned out, you realize that more bizarre methods await. The next chapter? It'll keep you on the edge of your seat, because even after the flames, the terror isn't over. The worst, it seems, is yet to come. By now, you've been through some of the most gruesome and twisted execution methods in Chinese history. But let me tell you, this next story isn't just about the cruelty of the death itself. It's about how a political execution turned into an absolute nightmare, one that even the emperor's closest advisors couldn't prevent. This isn't just a tale of a punishment gone wrong. It's a show trial that spiraled into unimaginable cruelty, something that would haunt the empire for centuries. Let's set the stage. It's the height of Imperial China's power, and the emperor has a rival, a high-ranking official who's gone against him, undermined his authority, or perhaps even conspired against the throne. Now, the emperor doesn't just want this person dead. He wants to send a message, public message. This execution isn't just a routine matter. It's a spectacle designed to show everyone exactly who's in control. So what does he do? He orders a show trial. But this isn't a typical trial. No, the emperor has already decided the outcome. The trial is nothing more than a formality, a sham meant to show the world that the emperor's power is absolute. The condemned man, let's call him Zhao, has no chance of survival. The court has already been rigged, and the outcome is preordained. Zhao is going to die, and everyone in the room knows it. But here's where it gets dark. Zhao, instead of begging for mercy or pleading for his life, defies the emperor in his final moments. He doesn't cry, doesn't scream. Instead, he stands tall, refusing to bow to the emperor's will. This is unthinkable. The emperor, seeing Zhao's defiance, decides to make the execution as publicly brutal as possible. A display of power and humiliation like never before. The execution is set to be a grand spectacle. The court is invited, the public is gathered, and all eyes are on the condemned man. But the emperor doesn't just kill him with a sword or an axe. Oh no, that would be too easy. The emperor wants to make Zhao's death as prolonged and painful as possible. What happens next is so gruesome, so graphic, that it becomes a defining moment in the history of political executions. Zhao is dragged before the crowd, and instead of a quick death, he is subjected to a slow and cruel process of torture, one that the public watches in horrified silence. The intention here isn't just to kill Zhao, it's to destroy him, to break him in front of the crowd. He's subjected to a series of brutal punishments, each worse than the last. His body is mutilated, his dignity stripped away as the emperor's men take their time making an example of him. The crowd watches in absolute horror, some unable to look, others transfixed by the unrelenting cruelty. Zhao's defiance, his refusal to break, becomes a symbol of his ultimate downfall. The emperor, in all his power, has turned his final moments into a lesson for the masses. Defiance equals destruction. But the absolute horror of this execution isn't just the physical suffering. It's the humiliation. Zhao is stripped of his humanity, reduced to an object of public cruelty. The emperor ensures that everyone is aware of the consequences of challenging his rule. The death isn't swift, it's drawn out, and Zhao's suffering is a message. No one can stand against the emperor. Historians still debate how far this execution went. Some say it was just a ritual punishment, a way to display imperial authority. Others argue it was a desperate move by an emperor who was losing control. Either way, the result was the same. An execution gone horribly wrong, a political show trial that went too far, turning what should have been a quick end into a public nightmare. Zhao's death became a cautionary tale, but not in the way the emperor intended. The emperor may have wanted to demonstrate his power, but what actually happened was that his cruelty backfired. People whispered of Zhao's bravery, of his defiance, and his unwillingness to break. The emperor had thought he was making a powerful statement, but in reality, he had created a martyr out of the very person he had sought to destroy. Zhao's death became a symbol, one that would inspire future generations to consider the actual cost of absolute power. The aftershock of this execution didn't just end with Zhao's death. It sent ripples through the court, through the empire. No one could forget the image of the defiant man, broken but unbowed, standing tall in the face of the emperor's cruelty. And from that day forward, everyone knew. The emperor's power could break a man's body, but it could never truly break his spirit. The lesson here isn't just about the extreme lengths to which the emperor would go to maintain his rule. It's about the danger of unchecked power, the ability of a ruler to go too far and destroy not just the person he's executing but the very morale of his empire. Now that we've seen the emperor's brutal use of political executions, let's move on to one that's a bit more personal, and quite possibly one of the most tragic and disturbing executions in Chinese history. This is the story of a legendary criminal, a figure so famous in his time that his death became more than just a tale of punishment. It became a cautionary legend that would haunt generations to come. You're about to hear the story of Liu Bei, a man who once walked the streets of ancient China as an influential and respected figure, someone whose name was known across the empire. But his fall from grace was just as legendary as his rise. In fact, it's hard to think of any criminal more famous than Liu Bei, whose name was once synonymous with success and cunning. Yet, even the most powerful could eventually fall prey to the emperor's wrath. Liu Bei's story wasn't that of a common criminal. No, he was a man who had earned his place in the imperial system. He'd managed to outsmart rivals, rise in the ranks of the court, and become a trusted figure in the eyes of many. But his downfall wasn't caused by an external enemy. It came from his own ambition. Like many others in the court, he believed he could manipulate his way into greater power. But when his schemes were uncovered, his fate was sealed, and the emperor wasted no time in deciding how to deal with him. But what makes Liu Bei's execution so disturbing wasn't just the fact that he was a criminal. It was the way his death was handled. The emperor ordered that Liu Bei be executed, but unlike the dramatic public executions we've seen, Liu Bei's death was carried out in complete secrecy. No public spectacle, no trial, no grand display of power. It was quiet, methodical, and efficient, just like the emperor preferred. Liu Bei was quietly executed, his death marked only by the coldness of the emperor's decree. But this wasn't the end of the story. Liu Bei's execution was forgotten by many in the court, but his death became a dark symbol in the minds of the people. They whispered about his rise to power, his cleverness, and how a man who once had so much power could be brought down so quietly. In a world where executions were meant to serve as public lessons, where death was a spectacle, Liu Bei's death was a reminder of how easily someone could be erased from history. The true horror of Liu Bei's death wasn't that he died, but that he died unremembered, his legacy erased by a regime that wanted to send a message that no one, not even the most powerful criminals, was safe from the emperor's will. The silence of his death made it all the more terrifying. As time passed, the lesson of Liu Bei's execution became apparent to those in the imperial court. No matter how legendary or powerful one was, one could always be discarded, one's name lost in the annals of history. And this served as a warning. If the emperor could erase someone like Liu Bei from existence, he could do it to anyone. All it took was a quiet order and a forgotten name. The emperor's reach was so absolute that even a legendary figure could be wiped out without anyone noticing. But despite the emperor's attempt to silence Liu Bei's legacy, his story still lingered, not in the way the emperor intended. Instead of fading into oblivion, it became a symbol for all those who were quietly erased from history. It served as a chilling reminder that, in the world of Imperial China, a person's fate was not in their own hands. Even the most celebrated lives could end with nothing more than a whispered rumor. This death, like so many others, showed the world how an emperor could control the narrative, erasing people from history with just one decision, without a second thought. Liu Bei's execution was a silent one, but its impact was far-reaching, for it sent a message to all who dared rise above their station. You can be erased, forgotten, reduced to nothing, no matter who you are or what you've accomplished. Now that we've seen the quiet erasure of a legendary figure, let's move to something far more dramatic and unsettling. There's an execution method that involves something as unexpected as crocodiles. Yes, crocodiles. And believe me, it's not what you're thinking. This one is going to leave you questioning everything about ancient justice. If you thought we had explored the absolute depths of ancient Chinese execution methods, well, brace yourself for one final surreal experience. Forget about the brutal cuts or the suffocating flowers. Let's talk about death by crocodile. At first, it sounds like something out of a dark fantasy story, a myth or a tale used to frighten children. But no, this was real. The emperor didn't just have his enemies executed by traditional methods. Sometimes, he decided that the end needed to be more theatrical, more wild, and definitely more terrifying. The scene begins with a ritualistic execution, a grand spectacle, like many others in ancient China. But this time, the emperor has chosen a much more creative and gruesome method. Picture this: a vast, deep pit filled with water, and at the bottom of that pit, a set of hungry crocodiles. The condemned person is then thrown into the pit, and the entire court is invited to witness the event. It's just about letting the crocodiles finish the job. But here's the twist: it's not that simple. The condemned person doesn't just fall into the water and get eaten immediately. No, they're allowed to try and escape, to scramble across the water, to outwit the crocodiles. The emperor knew what he was doing. This wasn't just about a swift execution. It was about psychological torment, and it was meant to show just how little control the victim had over their fate. The condemned person was thrown into the water, and at first, the crocodiles may not attack right away. They circle, waiting, watching. The condemned, terrified, scrambles to stay afloat. The crowd watches in morbid fascination as the person's struggle becomes more frantic, more desperate. They're trying to escape, trying to outlast the crocodiles, but the truth is clear. Escape is impossible. In some cases, the person might manage to climb out, but it wouldn't be easy. The crocodiles would snap at them from the water, and even if they did manage to escape, they were still doomed. The emperor wasn't simply interested in killing them. It was about humiliating them, watching them fight against a fate that was already sealed. Can you imagine what that must have felt like? You're thrown into a pit, and all you can see are the shimmering eyes of crocodiles circling beneath you. The heat of the crowd pressing in, the pressure to fight, to survive, while knowing deep down that your fate is already decided. The crocodiles are patient, no need to rush. They wait for the right moment and then they strike. Now, let's talk about why the emperor chose crocodiles for this particular method. It wasn't just about using animals as a means of execution, it was about showing power. Crocodiles are fierce, primal, and unpredictable. By using them, the emperor was making a statement. Life and death are in his hands, and nature itself will serve as his tool of punishment. The crocodiles weren't just part of the execution, they were a symbol of it. The emperor's use of these wild creatures reminded everyone in the empire that his will was as unstoppable and unpredictable as the animals themselves. If you defied the emperor, you were at the mercy of something far greater than a man. You were at the mercy of nature, the animals, and whatever cruelty the emperor could dream up. The absolute horror of death by crocodile wasn't just the danger of being eaten alive. It was the hopelessness of the situation. The condemned person wasn't facing an immediate death. They were trapped in a fight for survival, one they knew they couldn't win. And if they survived the crocodiles, they still faced the wrath of the emperor, who would have already deemed their fate to be sealed. It was the ultimate power play, a reminder that, in the emperor's eyes, no one was ever truly safe. But what's more chilling is the psychological aspect of this execution method. Imagine being dragged to that pit, knowing that there's no escape, that the moment you hit the water, your life is up to the whim of a creature much stronger than you. Even if you somehow manage to avoid the crocodiles, you knew there was no mercy to be had. This was psychological warfare, making the condemned person not only face death, but face it with the certainty of their failure. Historians still argue over the frequency of such executions. Some say they were used in rare cases for the most heinous crimes, while others believe it was just a legend that grew over time. But regardless of how often it was used, the idea behind it, the terror, the unpredictability, remains one of the most disturbing aspects of ancient Chinese punishment. And when you think about it, death by crocodile encapsulates so much of what we've seen throughout this series. It's not just about killing someone. It's about creating a story, a legacy, and a lesson for the people. The crocodiles weren't just there to kill. They were there to humiliate, to make sure the person's final moments were filled with fear, confusion, and helplessness. So, after everything we've seen, after the 1,000 cuts, the suffocating flowers, and the trial by fire, crocodile death stands as one of the most terrifying, frenzied methods of execution. It's not just about what happened in the moment, it's about the mind games involved. The condemned person wasn't simply a victim, they were a lesson to the world about the unpredictability of life and death in the Emperor's world. After all the horrors we've witnessed, death by 1,000 cuts, the suffocating flowers, crocodiles, and burning trials, you might think you've seen it all. But here's a twist. Some didn't just die. Some survived the impossible, even after facing execution methods that seemed like guaranteed death. Let's take a moment to meet Zhao Liang, a man whose name is still whispered in the halls of history, not because he was a hero, but because he survived an execution that was deemed impossible to survive. You see, Zhao was a high-ranking official, one of those in the emperor's favor. But he made the fatal mistake of crossing the wrong person in the court. Whether it was a political rival, an act of defiance, or simply bad luck, Zhao found himself sentenced to death, but not just any death. No, the emperor, in his twisted creativity, decided that Zhao's fate would be sealed in one of the most brutal, prolonged executions ever devised. The emperor ordered Ling Qi, death by 1,000 cuts, to be carried out on Zhao. The fact was, Zhao knew he was done for. He was tied to the execution post, and as the first cut sliced through his skin, he probably thought, "This is it." The executioner kept cutting, the pain unbearable, and Zhao's blood started to pour from his body. But here's the catch. Zhao didn't die. The cuts kept coming, each one deeper than the last. But somehow, Zhao's body refused to die. The crowd that had gathered around the execution ground couldn't believe their eyes. Zhao wasn't just enduring the cuts, he was still alive, still conscious, even as his body was being torn apart. The emperor's guards were ordered to make sure the execution didn't last too long, but they couldn't stop it. Zhao was defying the inevitable. His body had somehow managed to hold onto life despite the mutilation. Every ounce of blood in him was draining out, and yet his will to survive was unbroken. Historians still debate whether it was sheer luck, a miracle, or something more psychological in nature. Some say Zhao had fought against the pain, using every ounce of his mental strength to cling to life. Others argue that it was simply his body's natural resilience to injury, his physical endurance defying even the most barbaric punishments. But there's one thing everyone agrees on. Zhao's survival was a mockery of the emperor's power. It made the emperor appear weak, as if his absolute control over life and death wasn't as unshakable as he believed. To see someone survive an execution that was supposed to break them, it embarrassed the emperor. And, as they say, power doesn't take kindly to embarrassment. Eventually, the emperor had no choice but to order Zhao's final execution. They couldn't just let him keep breathing. The final blow came swiftly this time, a quick, clean strike to end his suffering. But the fact that Zhao had survived the impossible made his execution legendary. It wasn't just the method of death. It was the fact that someone had defied the emperor's will and lived to tell the tale, even for a brief moment. Zhao's survival didn't just make him a legend in the criminal world, it made him a symbol of resilience. For years, people whispered about him in awe and fear. How could someone survive the emperor's wrath? Was there something special about Zhao? Or was it just a twist of fate? In the end, Zhao became more than just a name. He became a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit, the embodiment of defiance in the face of death. His survival inspired many to think differently about the emperor's executions, about the absolute power that was supposed to be unchallengeable. Zhao's tale gave rise to legends about people who, against all odds, survived the impossible. And while many considered Zhao's survival to be a miracle, others saw it as a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the most brutal system could be defied. But here's the deeper takeaway. Zhao's story didn't just change history. It changed the perception of power itself. If one man could survive the emperor's most horrific punishment, what did that say about the system? What did that say about the emperor's control? Zhao proved, without a doubt, that no one, not even the emperor, could control every aspect of life and death. Sometimes, even in the most brutal system, survival was a matter of will, of defiance, and, yes, of fate. And as we move forward from this shocking tale, remember, even in the darkest of times, some stories are meant to survive. They are whispered, remembered, and retold for centuries to come. Zhao's legend didn't die with him. It lived on, spreading a message of defiance to all who came after him. But hold on. Things are about to get even stranger. The following story is about the emperor's ability to control life and death in ways that you never thought possible, through a deadly trial with a twist that will leave you questioning everything. So, after everything we've explored, the 1,000 cuts, the suffocating flowers, the trial by fire, and even death by crocodile, you might be wondering, how could such a system of brutal executions and public spectacles ever exist in the first place? What was the point of all this madness? And more importantly, what does this tell us about ancient Chinese justice and the power of the emperor? The reality is, the justice system in ancient China wasn't about fairness, mercy, or even rehabilitation. It was about power, pure, absolute control over life and death. The emperor, as the ruler of the land, wasn't just a leader. He was a god in the eyes of his people. His word was law, and his decisions weren't just political, they were divine. And when someone defied him, they didn't just face punishment. They faced a public spectacle, a lesson for the masses that would be etched into their memory forever. What we've seen throughout this journey is the unpredictability and psychological terror that defined these ancient executions. The emperor's methods weren't designed to be swift or merciful. No, they were intended to send a message. No one, not even the highest-ranking official, is beyond the emperor's reach. Whether you were a commoner or someone close to the throne, the emperor could destroy you without a second thought, and the more gruesome the punishment, the better. The more painful the end, the greater the lesson for others. Take a moment and think about the psychological impact these executions must have had. Imagine watching a public execution by crocodile, or seeing a man dragged to his death by 1,000 cuts. The horror would haunt you long after the spectacle ended. You wouldn't just fear the physical pain. It would be the terror of knowing that you could fall victim to such an awful fate at any moment. The emperor wasn't just executing people. He was controlling the mind of the entire population through fear, making them think twice before ever crossing him. But the absurdity of it all lies in the fact that these punishments, these public executions, weren't just about justice. They were about maintaining power. The emperor used death as a tool to remind his people of his unquestionable authority. And while many of these methods were effective in keeping the population in line, they were also deeply flawed. The actual cost of such cruelty was the erosion of trust, as well as the constant fear that anyone could be next. And when fear is the foundation of a society, you're never truly safe, because power can change hands at any moment. One of the most chilling takeaways from these stories is the legacy of fear that these executions left behind. It wasn't just about the people who died. It was about the message that was sent to everyone who watched. The emperor's reach was infinite, and the consequences of defying him were unimaginable. But in some twisted way, this system also proved that even the emperor's absolute power could be defied, whether through someone's courage in the face of death, or simply by surviving what should have been an impossible fate. As time went on, these stories of torture and execution became legendary, but not just for their brutality. They became a symbol of the impermanence of power and the resilience of those who dared to challenge it. Even in the darkest moments, some managed to survive, or at the very least, survive in memory. History has a strange way of remembering those who faced absolute power and lived to tell the tale. Now, look at the world we live in today. While execution methods have evolved, and justice systems, hopefully, have shifted to be more humane, we still face the question. What happens when those in power abuse their control? What happens when those who are supposed to protect us instead use their authority to inflict fear? History has a way of repeating itself, and the absurdity of ancient Chinese justice serves as a reminder that, no matter how far we've come, we must always question the systems that allow such absolute power to thrive. In the end, these ancient executions weren't just about death. They were about control, about maintaining an empire by instilling fear in people and preventing them from ever questioning the emperor's authority. And perhaps that's the most absurd part of all. That these methods were not just about killing, but about ensuring that no one could ever escape the emperor's will. However, we now leave these horrific methods behind. We move forward, learning from the past, with the hope that we never repeat the mistakes of ancient rulers. The legacy of these executions should remind us of the importance of justice, of mercy, and of the power of a society to stand up to the tyrants who might one day threaten to use their control to silence us all.